The front room still smelled of lamp oil and cold coffee when my husband spoke his first words to me, except they were not to me at all. He stood half-turned toward the dark hallway, his voice dropping soft, the way a person speaks to someone they already love. I had married him that afternoon. I had never once heard him speak before the vows. Now, on our wedding night, in a house that was supposed to be mine, he was murmuring gentle promises into a doorway where I could see no one standing. I did not yet know whose name lived in that shadow. My name is Miriam, and for most of my early life I lived inside a district where a woman's future was decided in rooms she was not invited into. I share these stories here for people who grew up learning that obedience was the same thing as love, and who are only now untangling the difference. If that is you, or if you simply want to understand how a quiet home can hold a loud secret, follow along and stay to the end, because the answer to that hallway is not what I feared. Before we go further, tell me one thing in the comments. When did you first sense a room was hiding something from you? I was 19 the autumn they married me off, and by then I had already learned not to ask why. My father had died the winter before, and my mother had drifted somewhere inside herself where none of us could reach her. There was no farm left to inherit, no brothers to keep a roof over me, only the charity of relatives who counted every plate I ate from. So when the elders said a good family had asked for me, I did not argue. A girl with nothing does not question a door that opens. I only wondered quietly why a family so respected would want a girl with nothing at all. The wedding itself passed like weather. I stood inside but could not feel. There were long tables, roast chicken cooling in pans, women I did not know pressing my hands and calling me blessed. My husband Amos sat beside me through the meal and said almost nothing, which everyone treated as ordinary. Men were quiet here. Marriage was a duty settled, not a romance begun. I told myself the speaking would come later, in the small hours when two strangers learned to become a household. I believed there would be a first sentence meant for me. I believed I would remember it kindly. That belief lasted until the guests left and the house went dark and I followed him inside. The front room held a bench along one wall, quilts folded on it in a neat stack that no one had bothered to put away. A single lamp burned low. On the table sat a cup of coffee gone cold, untouched, as though someone had poured it and then forgotten they were a person who drank things. Amos did not sit. He stood near the mouth of the hallway with his back half to me, and his shoulders changed, softened, the way a man's do when he stops performing for a room. Then he spoke. The words were low and warm and shaped for a listener I could not see. I caught the tenderness before I caught the meaning, the way you hear music from another room before you know the song. I remember thinking, absurdly, that it was sweet, that maybe he was praying. But you do not pray in that voice. You use that voice for one person, a person you already know the weight of. And I was standing right there, his new wife, and the voice was aimed entirely past me into the dark. I said his name, just that, only Amos, because I did not have anything else to offer a moment I did not understand. He turned then, and something closed over his face like a shutter drawn against light. He said goodnight. He said the room at the top of the stairs was mine. He said it kindly, and that kindness was somehow worse than coldness, because it told me he was managing me, the way you gently move a chair that is standing in the wrong spot. Then he went down the hallway toward the shadow, and I heard a second door close softly. I climbed the stairs to a room that had been prepared for me with real care. Fresh sheets, a washstand, a chair by the window. Someone had thought about my comfort. Someone had not thought that I might have ears. I sat on the edge of that bed for a long time, still in my wedding dress, listening to a house that was not asleep. There were footsteps below me, careful ones. There was that low voice again, briefly, and then nothing. I did not cry. I was too busy trying to solve a sentence I had only half heard, spoken to a person I had not seen. Here's the thing I understand now that I could not have named then. A young woman raised to be grateful is trained to explain away exactly this kind of moment. I told myself he was tired. I told myself grief made people strange, and I, of all people, knew what grief did. I gave that first night a dozen gentle interpretations, because the true one was too large to lift on my first evening in a strange house. It would take me the better part of a year to understand that the tenderness in his voice had been real and honest, and that the only lie in it was that I was ever meant to hear it. But that first night, I knew only one small fact, and I turned it over and over until the lamp oil ran low. My husband had spoken his first words in our marriage to someone in that hallway, not to me, and whoever it was had mattered enough that he had gone to them before he had said a single true thing to his wife. I lay down at last without changing out of my dress, and I stared at the ceiling of a room built for my comfort inside a house built for something I did not yet understand. Somewhere below me, a floorboard settled, and I promised myself I would learn who was standing in. The house I had married into belonged to the Baylor family, and in our district, the name carried a weight that opened doors and closed mouths. They farmed well, gave generously at every gathering, and never missed a Sunday service. Old Katie Beeler, my husband's mother, was the sort of woman other women grew quiet around, the kind whose approval was currency and whose displeasure was a debt you paid slowly. When people spoke of my marriage, they spoke of my luck, a girl with no farm, no father, no dowry to speak of, folded into one of the steadiest families in the settlement. I was supposed to feel rescued, and for a while I did try to feel it. The match had been made faster than anything I had ever seen. My aunt mentioned it one week as a possibility, and by the next it was decided. The way you might decide the weather had turned, and it was time to bring in the wash. No long courtship, no drives home from singings, none of the slow, careful looking that usually came before a wedding in our community. I told myself families with means simply moved differently, that certainty was a privilege the poor could not afford. But looking back, the speed itself was the first thing that should have troubled me. Nothing gets settled that quickly unless someone already knew the answer they wanted. I want to be careful here because I am telling you about one family in one district, not about a whole people. Most marriages I grew up around were quiet, decent, unremarkable partnerships between people who came to care for each other. What happened in the Baylor house was not the custom of my community. It was something that family did, hidden inside the shape of things that looked ordinary from the outside. That is the trick of a respectable household. It borrows the appearance of what everyone considers normal, and it hides the exception inside it, and no one thinks to look because looking would be an insult to such good people. From the outside, my new life looked like a gift, a warm kitchen, a full pantry, more security than I had known since my father was alive. But security, I would learn, is not the same as belonging, and a full pantry does not mean a full place at the table. In those first weeks, I was given work but not welcome. I was shown where things were kept, but never asked what I thought. Katie ran the household with a soft, unhurried authority that never once raised its voice, and everyone in the house arranged themselves around her the way iron filings arrange around a magnet. Even Amos, a grown man, seemed to move by her weather, and I had nothing of my own. This is the part outsiders find hardest to believe. I had signed nothing, owned nothing, held no money that was mine to spend. My clothing came from the family. My food came from their table. If I had wanted to leave, I had no fare to leave with and nowhere that would take me back, since the relatives who had passed me along had made it clear their charity ended at my wedding. I was a wife in name and a dependent in fact, and dependence, I was learning, is a very quiet kind of cage. You do not notice the bars until you reach for something and find you cannot pay for it. There was one thing that snagged at me in those early days, though I could not yet say why. My mother's oldest sister, a woman named Fanny, had married into a family much like this one long ago, under circumstances no one ever fully explained. She had grown thin and silent over the years, a woman who spoke only when spoken to and flinched at raised voices that never came. As a child, I had thought she was simply made that way. Now, moving through the Baylor house, I kept thinking of Aunt Fanny and of how a certain kind of marriage seemed to fold a woman smaller and smaller until she nearly disappeared into the wallpaper. If you have ever moved into a house that was not built for you and felt the walls quietly deciding your shape, you already understand the feeling I am describing, and I would be glad to know it in the comments. Because that is what those first weeks were. Not cruelty, exactly. No one struck me, no one starved me. It was subtler than that, 1,000 small signals that I was there to serve a purpose, already decided, and that my only real task was to not ask what the purpose was. I learned the household's rhythms. I learned when to speak and when to keep my hands busy, and I learned to stop glancing at that hallway, but I never stopped hearing it. Some nights, lying in my careful little room, I would catch the low murmur of Amos's voice through the floor. The same tenderness from my wedding night poured steadily into the dark below, never words I could make out, just the shape of gentleness, given nightly to someone who was not me. I told myself it was none of my concern, that a wife did not pry, that gratitude did not ask questions. Yet the questions came anyway, in the small hours, patient and unwelcome. Who slept down that hallway? Why the door stayed closed to me? And why a family this careful had needed a girl with nothing to complete their picture? That dark. The change began, as most of my troubles did, with me trying to be useful. Autumn was turning hard toward winter, and the pantry needed ordering before the cold set in. I had kept house for my aunt and knew how to lay a larder in for the season. So one morning I offered to sort the shelves and set the household records straight, the way any wife might. I meant it kindly. I wanted a place in that house that was mine to tend. I wanted to matter somewhere. Katie thanked me and said the pantry would be welcome help, and for 1 hour I felt almost like I belonged there, standing among the jars with a purpose in my hands. The trouble came when I opened the small cabinet beside the pantry, thinking to sort whatever papers the household kept, the seed orders and the store accounts and the letters that any farm accumulates. It was locked. That was not so strange in itself, but as I stood there, Katie came in from the other room without a sound, the way she always seemed to arrive, and told me gently that the cabinet was not mine to open. She smiled when she said it. She said some things were the family's own keeping, and that I need not trouble myself with them. Then she reached past me and moved a worn sewing basket from the shelf to the high one, out of my reach, as if straightening a room. I noticed the basket then, though I would not have if she had let it sit. It was an ordinary thing, brown wicker gone soft at the handle, the kind every household owned. But no one in that house ever sewed from it. I had watched Katie mend by the window with a different tin of thread. I had seen the daughters work their needles in the evenings from baskets of their own. That one basket sat on its shelf untouched, and now she had moved it higher, and the moving told me more than the basket ever could have. You do not lift an ordinary thing out of a person's reach. You lift the thing that matters. Amos came in from the barn while this was happening, and I turned to him, half hoping he would smooth it over, tell me of course I could tidy the papers, welcome me the way a husband might. He did not. He looked at his mother, then at me, and said only that Ma'am knew best how things were kept, and that I should not concern myself. His voice was not unkind. It never was. That was the strange, wearing thing about that house. No one ever slammed a door on me. They simply, quietly closed them and thanked me for understanding, and I was left holding a politeness that felt like a hand pressed flat against my chest. I finished the pantry alone. I remember the light going gray through the window as I worked, and the cold coming up through the floorboards into my feet, and the particular loneliness of doing careful work no one would acknowledge. I had wanted to be trusted with the ordinary business of the home, and instead I had learned exactly where the edges of my welcome lay. There were rooms I could clean but not know. There were papers I could dust around but not read. There was a basket I was not to touch, moved higher the moment I looked at it. I was a wife allowed everywhere except the places that would have told me anything true. That night, small things I had not noticed began to add up. I had asked a few days before whether I might drive into town for thread and a few needful items, and the answer had come back soft and sideways, that someone would fetch what I needed, that I need not go out in the cold. I had thought it kindness. Now I understood it as a wall built out of consideration, which is the hardest kind of wall to name, because if you push against it, you look ungrateful. I was being cared for and contained in the same breath, and the two had been braided together so tightly I could not pull them apart. I lay awake that night doing the arithmetic of my own life and not liking the sum. I could not open the cabinet. I could not read the papers. I could not go to town alone. I could not reach the basket. Every door in that house that led toward understanding had a gentle hand resting on it, keeping it shut. And below me, faint through the floor, came that voice again. Amos's voice, low and tender in the dark, saying its nightly words to whoever slept down that hall. I had stopped pretending I did not hear it. I had only started wondering what it would cost me to find out. Because here is what I understood by then, lying in that room built for my comfort, a locked cabinet I could accept. A private family is entitled to its own accounts, but a basket that no one sewed from, lifted out of my reach by a woman who missed nothing, was not privacy. It was concealment, and concealment has a shape you can feel even before you can see it. Someone in that house was keeping something, and they had brought me in and married me to their son and given me a warm room and a full plate, and still they did not trust me to touch a brown wicker basket. I meant to learn why. I only did not yet know what it would take from me to do it. After the pantry, Amos began to be gone. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, but in the ordinary way a man can absent himself from his own house. He took to leaving after the morning chores and returning past dark, saying only that he had business, that he was needed elsewhere. Some evenings he did not come to supper at all, and Katie would set his place and clear it again without comment, as though his empty chair were a thing the family had long practiced around. I did not know where he went. I did not feel I had the standing to ask. A wife of 2 months who could not open a cabinet does not demand an accounting of her husband's days. So I did what I had been raised to do. I decided the fault was mine. I thought perhaps I had displeased him, that my questions about the pantry had marked me as a woman who did not know her place, and I set out to prove I did. I rose earlier. I worked harder. I kept my voice soft and my hands busy, and my curiosity buried where no one could see it. I made his coffee the way I had learned. He took it and set it out even on the mornings he barely looked at me. I was trying to earn my way into a marriage that, I did not yet know, had never been offered to me in the first place. It was Amos's younger sister, Lydia, who first let a crack of light in. She was perhaps 16, still quick with her feelings in the way the young are before a household teaches them stillness. One afternoon, we were putting up the last of the apples, our hands sticky and the kitchen warm with the smell of it, and she watched me for a while in silence before she spoke. She said I worked too hard for a woman trying to fix something that was not hers to fix. When I asked what she meant, she went quiet, glanced toward the door, and said only that I should not ask the basket questions out loud. Then she would say no more. I want to be honest about how a warning like that lands. It did not frighten me the way you might think. It steadied me, in a terrible way, because it told me I was not imagining things. For weeks I had wondered whether the wrongness I felt was only my own grief and loneliness twisting an ordinary house into something sinister. Now a girl who had lived in that house her whole life had told me, in as few words as she dared, that there was a real thing to be careful of, and that the basket was the center of it. I was not mad. I was simply standing near something the family had spent years learning not to name. The small denials continued, and I began to see the pattern in them. When I asked Katie whether I might write to my mother and enclose a little money for her comforts, I was told the family would see to my mother's needs, that I need not worry about money at all. It sounded like generosity. It meant I never held a coin. When I mentioned I might like to visit a cousin 2 districts over, there was always a reason the trip could wait. The roads, the weather, the work. I was never refused. I was only endlessly delayed and provided for, until I understood that a woman with no money and no way to travel is not a wife. She is a resident, kept. And the strange thing was how the community praised it. At service, at frolics, at the market days I was occasionally allowed to attend under someone's watchful company. Women would take my hands and tell me how blessed I was, how good the Baylors were to have taken me in. They said it warmly, and they said it often. And after a while, I noticed it did not sound like praise so much as recitation, as though they had all agreed on the words beforehand. Twice I saw 2 of the older women exchange a look when my name came up, quick and knowing, the kind of look that passes between people who share a thing they will not say. That look told me the whole district was in on a story about me that I had never been told. I began for the first time to doubt out loud inside my own head, not the small doubt of a new wife finding her footing, but the larger, colder one. I had assumed I was chosen because a good family took pity on a girl with nothing. But pity does not lock cabinets, pity does not move baskets out of reach or exchange knowing looks at the market. I started to suspect that I had been chosen for a reason, a specific reason, and that the reason had nothing to do with mercy and everything to do with the thing sleeping down that hallway. A girl with no family to ask after her is not a burden to such people. She is convenient. Then, one evening in late November, I overheard Katie speaking low with her eldest daughter in the next room, and I caught only fragments before they lowered their voices further. But I caught enough. They were speaking of me. They were saying it might be time to have a talk with me, to settle me, that I had grown restless, and restlessness was not good for anyone. The word they used, settle, was the word you use for an animal that will not take to a new stall. I stood on the other side of that wall with a dish going cold in my hands and understood that whatever I had begun to sense, the family had sensed it too. They were not going to wait for me to find the basket. They were going to gather and manage me before I could. The talk came on a Sunday evening, after the supper things were cleared and the younger children sent up to bed. I knew it was coming the way you know a storm from the pressure in the air. Katie asked me to sit, and when I came into the kitchen, the chairs had been drawn into a loose circle, and they were already filled. Katie, her eldest daughter, Sarah, an older cousin who advised the family on such matters, and Amos at the edge of it, looking at his own hands. No minister, no bishop. This was not a matter for the church. This was the family's own court, and I was the one brought before it. They began gently, the way that house did everything. Katie said they had noticed I seemed unsettled, that I asked after things a wife did not need to trouble with, that I had spoken of travel and letters and money in ways that suggested I was not content. She said all of this softly, sorrowfully, as though my unhappiness were a small illness they wished to nurse me through. And as she spoke, I watched my own concerns come out of her mouth transformed. My questions became ingratitude. My loneliness became restlessness. My wanting to understand the house I lived in became a kind of pride that a humble woman ought to pray against. That is the thing I most want you to understand about that room, because it is the thing that took me longest to see. They did not argue with what I felt. They renamed it. Every true thing about my situation was picked up, turned over, and set back down with a different label, one that made the trouble mine. I was not being kept from money. I was failing to trust the family's provision. I was not being watched. I was being lovingly cared for. I was not lonely because something was wrong. I was restless because something was wrong with me. When people control the words for your experience, they do not need to lock you in a room. You will build the walls yourself. Sarah spoke then, and her part was to remind me kindly of what I owed. She listed it like a ledger read aloud. A roof when I had none. Food when my own people had passed me hand to hand like an unwanted parcel. A respectable name to carry, a husband, a home, a place in a family that others would give much to enter. Each item was true, and each one was a stone laid on my chest, and by the time she finished, I was meant to feel that any grievance I held was an insult to people who had saved me. I felt it. That is the shame of it. I sat there and felt grateful and trapped in the same breath. What they asked of me was simple. They wanted me to say I was content. Not to be content, which no one can command, but to say it out loud in that circle, and to stop asking the questions that had brought us all together. They framed it as peace. Say you are at peace, Miriam, and we will all be at peace. And underneath the softness ran a current I could not miss because the cousin let it slip when she said that a woman who could not settle might be happier among relatives who understood her better. They did not name it a threat. They did not have to. I understood that my place in that house depended on my willingness to stop seeing what was in front of me. But something in that room gave me the first true piece of the puzzle, and it came, of all people, from Amos. When the cousin spoke of sending me to relatives, he looked up sharply and said no, that could not be, that I was needed here. It was the most feeling I had heard in his voice since the wedding, and it was not tenderness toward me. It was alarm. I was needed here, not wanted, needed. And in the silence after he said it, Katie's face closed, just for an instant, the way a person's does when someone has said one word too many in company. I understood then that my staying was not about my marriage at all. It was about a need that would come apart if I left. I gave them their sentence. I am ashamed to tell you that, but I will, because pretending I was braver than I was would dishonor the woman I actually was that night. I said I was content. I said I had been foolish and would trouble them no more. The circle eased. Katie smiled and said the Lord blessed a peaceful house. And they rose and drifted back into their evenings as though nothing had happened, as though they had not just watched a woman agree to stop believing her own eyes. I sat a moment longer in the emptied circle of chairs and felt the true shape of my situation settle over me at last, cold and clear, because now I knew two things I had not known before. I knew the marriage had been made to satisfy some need of Katie's, some obligation of the family's own, a debt being paid in a currency that turned out to be me, and I knew that whatever slept down that hallway was not merely a family secret, but the very reason I existed in that house. Amos had said it without meaning to. I was needed. A wife is loved or tolerated or endured, but she is not needed the way they needed me, like a beam holding up a roof that would otherwise fall. That night I stopped asking questions out loud, exactly as they wanted. I only began, very quietly, to plan how I would find the answers where no one could see me look. The chance came with the baking, as so much in a woman's life does. Twice a month, a widowed cousin named Hannah came to help with the heavy work, the bread and the pies for church Sundays, and she came alone, without Katie hovering, because Katie trusted her the way you trust furniture that has always held your weight. Hannah was perhaps 50, broad-handed and slow-spoken, a woman who had buried a husband young and never remarried and lived on the edge of the family's generosity ever since. She had been coming to that house for longer than I had been alive. If anyone knew its rooms and its silences, it was her, and on baking days, for a few hours, it was only the two of us in the ovens. For weeks I said nothing to her that mattered. We worked in the ordinary rhythm of women who share a kitchen, passing the flour, minding the fire, speaking of small things. But Hannah watched me the way older women watch the young, and one cold morning, elbow deep in dough, she said without looking up that I had the same look Fanny used to have. I stopped. Fanny was my own aunt, the thin, silent one who had married into a family like this and shrunk to nothing over the years. I had never told Hannah of her. That she knew the name at all, and knew the look, meant these things traveled between such houses like water finding its level. I asked her what she meant, and she did not answer at first. She kneaded and portioned and let the silence do its work, and I understood she was deciding how much a woman in her position could afford to say. Because Hannah had her own cage, softer than mine, but real. She had no home of her own. She lived on what the family allowed her, moved between relatives as she was useful, and one wrong word could see her set out with nowhere to go. Whatever she knew, she had carried it a long time by keeping it behind her teeth, and I was asking her to risk the only roof she had. I did not blame her hesitation. I recognized it. But she talked in the end in fragments, the way frightened people tell the truth. She told me that Amos had loved a woman once, years back. A woman from outside the district whom the family had judged unsuitable, and that whatever had passed between them had ended badly and quietly in the way that scandals in careful families always end. She did not say the woman's name. She said only that there had been trouble, and that trouble in that family was never solved by facing it. It was solved by arranging things until the trouble could no longer be seen, and then she looked at me, flower to her wrists, and I understood I was one of the things that had been arranged. I asked her, my voice low, what any of it had to do with me, with the locked cabinet, with the basket that no one sewed from. At the mention of the basket, her hands went still on the dough, and for a long moment the only sound was the fire. Then she said, quiet as a confession, that when she was a young woman she had once spoken up about a marriage much like mine, had said aloud that it was not right, and had learned what speaking cost. She had lost her standing, her welcome, very nearly her place in the community, and she had never made that mistake again. That was what she had lost, her voice. She had traded it for a roof, and she had been paying the difference ever since. She would not tell me the rest. She said some things a woman had to find with her own eyes, because told secrets could be denied, but seen ones could not. And then she did a thing I did not fully understand until later. She reached up to the high shelf where Katie kept the brown wicker basket out of my reach, took it down as easily as if it were hers, and set it on the table between us among the flour and the dough. She did not open it. She only rested her hand on the lid a moment, the way you touch a grave, and said, "Read the last page." Then she covered it with a cloth and put it back, and would say no more. I finished the baking in a kind of trance, my hands doing the work while my mind circled that basket like a moth. Read the last page, not the first, not the whole of it, the last. Whatever the basket held was a record of some kind, a thing written down and added to over time, and the newest entry, the last one, was the one Hannah wanted me to see. I understood now that the marriage was not a beginning at all. It was a repair. Something had broken in that family years ago, and I was the patch laid over the break, and the basket held the account of it in someone's careful hand. That night, I lay awake with a single question turning where sleep should have been. If the basket was a ledger and the last page was mine, then whose names filled the pages before me? Aunt Fanny had married into a house like this. Hannah had watched an arrangement go wrong and lost her voice for saying so. How many women were written in that book, patched over how many breaks, and what did it mean that I had been added to their number without ever being told the number existed? Below me, faint through the floor, Amos's voice murmured its nightly tenderness into the dark, and for the first time I did not resent it. I only wondered which broken thing it was trying every night to keep whole. I got to the basket on a morning when the whole house emptied out at once. Church was at a neighbor's that Sunday, and the family left ahead of me while I begged off with a headache that was not entirely invented. The moment the last buggy cleared the lane, I climbed onto a chair, took the basket down, and sat on the kitchen floor with it in my lap, my heart going hard. Under a folded square of cloth and a few loose spools laid over the top to disguise it, there was a book. Not a ledger from a store, but a plain-bound notebook, its pages filled front to back in a small, patient, feminine hand I recognized from the household lists. Katie's hand. It was a record of arrangements. That is the only way I know to say it. Page after page, going back decades. Each entry naming a woman and a date, and a few dry lines about what her marriage had settled. A cousin married quickly to quiet talk of a child come too soon, a daughter matched to a man whose family held a debt, a girl from a poor branch of the family folded into a richer one to smooth over some old quarrel. Beside each name, in that same even hand, was a note of what the marriage had cost the family and what it had saved them. It was bookkeeping. Women entered as expenses and reconciled as accounts. And near the end, I found my Aunt Fanny's name, and the word beside it was silence. I had believed, until that floor, that I was married to be a wife. I sat there and read the truth of it in Katie's own careful letters. I turned to the last page, the one Hannah had sent me to, and I found my own name written in that steady hand, Miriam, the date of my wedding, and beside it, a single line that undid me, brought in to give the boy's child a mother the district would not question. I read it 3 times. I read it until the words stopped rearranging themselves into something kinder. There was a child. There had always been a child. And I had been purchased, in effect, to hang a respectable name over it. The pieces fell into their places all at once, and the falling hurt. The woman Amos had loved, the unsuitable one from outside the district, had borne him a child before the family shut the whole thing away. A child cannot be hidden the way a scandal can. A child needs a household, a name, a mother the community will look at and ask no questions of. And who asked questions of a marriage between a good Byler son and a poor orphaned girl the family took in out of Christian charity? No one. That was the genius of it, and the cruelty. I was not chosen despite having nothing. I was chosen because I had nothing. A woman with no family to inquire after her was the safest possible cover. The tenderness in the hallway made sense now, and understanding it broke something in me that the secrecy alone had not. Those first words, the ones spoken past me on my wedding night, had not been for a rival or a mistress. They had been for a child. Amos had gone down that hallway before he said a true thing to his wife, because down that hallway was the one person in the house he actually loved, the one he was trying every single night to keep safe. The voice I had resented for months was a father's voice. The gentleness was real. The only lie in it, exactly as I had feared, was that I had ever been the one it was meant for. And here is the thing I turned over on that floor, the thing that made grief settle in where anger might have. Katie had not done this out of simple wickedness. I could see her logic laid out in her own hand across those pages. She was protecting the family, the name, the standing that let the Baylors do good in the community and hold their heads up at service. She was protecting her son from a ruin that would have followed him all his life. And she was, in her own bent way, protecting the child, giving it a home no one would whisper about. She had built a machine out of women to keep her family whole, and she believed, I think, that she was being merciful. That was the worst part. She meant it kindly. They always did. But mercy that is never told to the person it uses is not mercy. It is only management. I had been managed. From the first week, my father grew ill, moved from hand to hand, and finally set into place, like a piece in a game whose rules were kept from me on purpose. I sat on that cold floor with the evidence of it in my lap and understood fully that nothing about my life in that house had been what I was told. Not the charity, not the marriage, not the kindness. All of it had been the careful, loving, terrible work of keeping a family's story clean, and I was the newest chapter, written in a hand that was not my own. I copied nothing that morning. There was no time, and my hands shook too badly. I put the book back under its cloth and its spools, set the basket on its high shelf, and climbed down and washed my face at the basin before the family came home. But I had read the last page, as Hannah told me to, and it had changed the shape of everything, backward and forward at once. Every soft denial, every knowing look at the market, every night of murmured tenderness through the floor, now meant something I could not unknow, and forward it meant a harder thing still. Somewhere down that hallway was a child who had been given a mother who had never been told she was one, and I was going to have to decide what to do with a truth no one had ever meant for me to hold. Knowing did not free me. That is the part no one tells you about the truth. I had imagined that if I ever understood my situation, understanding would be a door. Instead, it was only a clearer view of the walls. I still had no money of my own. I still had nowhere to go, no family that would take me back, no fare to carry me anywhere if they would. The knowledge that I had been placed like a stone in someone else's wall did not lift me out of the wall. It only let me feel, precisely, the weight of what was resting on me, and how far the drop would be if I moved. And there was the child. I met the child properly not long after the basket, once I stopped being kept from that end of the house so carefully, because a woman who has agreed to be content is a woman they relax around. A small boy, 3 years old, quiet in the way children get when the grown people around them are always managing something. His name was Eli. He had Amos's serious brow and a way of watching a room before he trusted it. He had been told, I gathered, that I was simply another woman of the house, and he regarded me at first the way he regarded all of them, from a safe distance. But children do not stay at a distance from someone who is gentle every single day. So I made a choice, though I did not name it a choice at the time. I decided that whatever I had been brought there to be on paper, I would be something real to that boy, not a cover, not a name hung over him for the district's benefit, a steady presence, a warm hand, a person who was the same on the hard days as on the easy ones. I told him stories. I mended his small clothes. I let him help me in the kitchen and did not mind the mess. And slowly, over the winter, he began to come to me, to reach for my skirt in a crowded room, to say my name when he woke frightened. I had been made a mother in a ledger. I was becoming one on the floor, in the dark, one small trust at a time. But I did not forget the ledger. On the nights when the house was fully asleep, I began to copy it, Not all of it, only the pages that mattered, the names and dates and the dry, cruel notes beside them. Working by a low lamp with a stub of pencil and scraps of paper I hid inside the seam of my mattress. I do not fully know why I did it then. I only knew that a thing written in one woman's hand could be denied, altered, burned, and that if it existed nowhere but Katie's book, then it did not truly exist at all. I wanted it to exist somewhere else. I wanted, for the first time in my life, a record that was mine, made by my own hand, that no one could rename. Amos and I, meanwhile, drifted into a strange and quiet partnership. Not a marriage exactly, but not enemies either. I think, once he understood that I knew, something in him eased, the way a man eases when a lie he has been carrying is finally shared, even if it is shared with the person the lie was told to. We did not speak of it plainly. We spoke of it around the edges, in glances over Eli's head, in the way he began to trust me with the boy. He was as trapped as I was. In his own fashion, a man who had loved the wrong woman and lost her, and been handed a wife to solve the problem she left behind. His mother ran him as surely as she ran me. He was not a villain. He was another arrangement. There was one evening, near the turn of the year, when he came the closest he ever came to honesty. We were both awake late with Eli, who was feverish, and in the long, tired hours by the boy's bed, Amos told me a little of the woman he had loved, not her name, even then, but that she was gone, truly gone, and that Eli was all that remained of a part of his life he was not allowed to grieve out loud. For a moment, in that dim room over that sick child, I felt almost seen by him, two people bound to the same secret, tending the same small life. I let myself hope briefly that we might build something true out of the wreckage we had been handed. The hope did not last, and I want to tell you exactly why it failed, because it did not fail dramatically. It failed the way most hopes in that house failed, quietly, by his choosing silence over me one more time. When morning came and Eli's fever broke and Katie swept in to take charge, Amos went still again. Whatever had passed between us in the dark closed over the moment the daylight and his mother returned. I understood then that he would always choose the family's silence over any truth we might have shared. He was too afraid and too accustomed and too tired. The man who had murmured tenderness through the floor could love a child in secret, but he could not stand up in the light for a wife, or for me. And that, more than the ledger, is what finally woke me, not the discovery that I had been used. I had made my peace, of a bitter kind, with being used. What I could not make peace with was watching Eli grow up inside the same machine that had ground down Fanny and silenced Hannah and written my name on a last page, and doing nothing. He was 3. Someday he would be old enough to be told a version of himself that was not true, or old enough to be used, in his turn, to keep the family's story clean. I had been given the truth by accident, at real cost. I began to believe I had no right to sit on it. A child deserved the honesty I had been denied, and I was, whether I had chosen it or not, the only mother he had. The thing that forced my hand came in early spring, and it came in a form I recognized instantly because it was me. Katie began to speak in that same soft, managing voice of a young woman 2 districts over. A cousin of the family, a good boy, needed settling, she said, and there was a girl, poor, orphaned in all but name, who would be grateful for a place. I sat at the table with my mending in my lap and felt the blood go cold in me because I knew that sentence. I had been that girl. I was listening to the next page of the ledger being planned aloud over supper, and this time I knew exactly what the word grateful was hiding. I did not sleep for 2 nights. The choice laid itself out plainly, and neither side of it was clean. If I stayed silent, I kept everything I had. The roof, the full plate, Eli, who now cried for me when he woke, my place such as it was. If I spoke, if I found a way to warn that girl before the arrangement closed over her, I risked all of it and worse. Katie could send me away as a difficulty and keep Eli behind. I could lose the child I had come to love in the act of trying to spare a stranger. There was no version of speaking that did not cost me the one thing I most wanted to protect. I went to Hannah. It was baking day, and I told her everything, the ledger, the last page, the boy, the new girl being spoken of. and I watched the old fear rise in her face, the fear of a woman who had lost her voice once and never dared find it again. For a long while she said nothing, working the dough as if she could knead the choice away. Then she said something I did not expect. She said she had stayed quiet 40 years, and it had bought her a roof and cost her every night of sleep since Fanny's name went into that book. She said she was too old now for it to matter what they did to her. And she said, if I meant to warn the girl, she would help me reach her. Lydia surprised me too. The younger sister who had first whispered the warning about the basket had grown that winter, watched me with Eli, watched her mother plan the next arrangement, and something in her had turned. She could not defy Katie openly. She was too dependent, too young. But she knew the roads, knew which of the family's errands would take a buggy near the girls' district, and she offered quietly to see that I was on one of them. I understood what these two women were doing. They were lending me the courage they had each been made to give up, one long ago and one before she had ever fully found it. I was not acting alone. That mattered more than I can say. Katie made her last attempt to hold me the day before I went, and she made it, as always, out of kindness. She found me alone and spoke of how well I had settled, how good I was with Eli, how the family was thinking of my future, of security, of a place that would always be mine so long as the household stayed peaceful. She did not threaten. She reminded. She laid out gently everything I stood to lose, and she made sure I understood that all of it rested on the peace of the family, and that the peace of the family rested on things staying unspoken. It was the most naked the arrangement ever got between us, dressed to the last in the language of care. I went the next day. Lydia's errand put the buggy within reach of the girls' district, and Hannah had sent word ahead through a chain of women I never fully saw, the quiet network that runs under every community and carries the things the men never hear. I met the girl at a market, among the stalls and the noise where two women talking drew no notice. She was 16 maybe, thin and hopeful and grateful already for an offer not yet made, exactly as I had been. I did not tell her everything. I did not have the time or the right. I told her only what I most wished someone had told me. Ask what the marriage is for. Ask who lives in the house. Do not let anyone make your gratitude do your thinking for you. I do not know to this day whether she fully understood me. She looked frightened and confused, the way you do when a stranger hands you a truth you have no place to put yet. But I saw something take root behind her eyes, a small, hard seed of a question, and I knew it would grow whether she wanted it to or not, because questions do. That was all I could give her. Not rescue, not a way out. Only the one thing I had been denied, the knowledge that the door had a purpose before she walked through it. Then I got back in the buggy and rode home to whatever waited for me, and I found, to my surprise, that I was not afraid anymore. The arrangement fell apart within a fortnight. Whether it was my few words or the girl's own family growing cautious, the match cooled and then died, and no one ever said why. But Katie knew. She did not confront me. That was not her way. But the house changed toward me the way weather changes before a hard season. The warmth withdrew. The knowing looks came inside the walls now. I was no longer content Miriam who had settled well. I was a difficulty again, a variable that had slipped the family's control, and I understood that my usefulness had reached its edge. I had broken the one rule that had kept me fed and housed and near the child I loved. I had spoken, and now I would have to learn what speaking cost. What it cost was my place, though they were far too careful to throw me out. That was never how the Bealers did anything. Instead, I was moved, slowly, to the edges of the household, the way you set aside a tool you no longer trust but do not wish to be seen discarding. My tasks grew smaller and more separate. I was less often left alone with Eli. Katie spoke of how the boy was getting old enough for the family to see to his raising more directly, and I heard under the words, the machine deciding it no longer needed the mother it had bought. I had made myself into something real for that child, and the family that had written me in was quietly writing me out. So let me answer, plainly, the question I have kept you waiting on, because you have earned the whole of it. The first words my husband ever spoke in our marriage, the ones aimed past me into the dark hallway on our wedding night, were these: I will keep you safe, I promise. He was not speaking to a lover. He was not speaking to a rival. He was kneeling in that hallway, though I could not see it, beside a small, frightened boy who had been woken by strangers filling his house, and he was making the only vow he truly meant that day. Not to me, to his son. A father's promise, spoken over a child the family had spent 3 years pretending into invisibility. Everything else arranges itself around that one sentence. Amos had loved a woman the family judged beneath them. She had borne Eli and then gone, in some way no one would ever fully tell me, and the family had faced a child that could not be hidden and a name that could be. Katie had solved it the way she solved everything, by finding a woman with nothing to lose and nothing to ask, and marrying her to the problem. I was the respectable mother the district would never question. My wedding was not a beginning of anything, it was the closing of an account, and the tenderness I had overheard and resented for months had been the truest thing in that house all along, and never, not for one moment, meant for me. Who knew and when? Katie engineered all of it, from the first offer passed through my aunt to the last careful denial. Amos knew and complied out of love for his son and fear of his mother in equal measure. Sarah knew and Hannah knew, and Fanny had lived her own version of it long before me, and half the older women of the district knew enough to trade a look at Market and keep their mouths shut. The only person in the whole arrangement who did not know what the arrangement was the woman it was built around. That is what a good family can do. It can make a secret so ordinary that everyone carries a corner of it and no one feels the weight. And I will not pretend there was justice, because there was not the kind stories promise. Katie was never confronted, never shamed, never made to answer for the book of women she kept in a sewing basket. She is, as far as I know, keeping it still, adding names in that same even hand. The family's standing in the district was never scratched. The men never learned what the women had always known. What broke the pattern in the end was small and incomplete. One arrangement stopped, one girl warned, one boy loved a little more truly than the plan required. That is all the victory I can honestly report. It was not nothing. It was also not enough, and I have made my peace with holding both. I left that autumn, a year and some after I entered. I will not dress it as an escape, because it was quieter than that word. When it became clear the family no longer needed me and would slowly starve my place until I went on my own terms instead of theirs. Hannah knew of a widow in another district who needed help and asked no questions, and the same quiet network of women that had carried my warning carried me. I walked out with a bundle of clothes and sewn into the seam of my mattress cover, which I took with me, the pages I had copied by lamplight. The only record of that family's arrangements written in a hand that was not Katie's. Written in mine. The hardest part, the part that still finds me on some nights, was Eli. I could not take him. He was Amos's son, held by law and blood and a whole community, and there was no version of leaving that let me carry him out the door. I had become his mother in every way that the heart counts and none of the ways the world does. I said my goodbye to a 3-year-old who did not understand it, tucked him in one last time, and left him to a family I did not trust to love him truly, only to keep him. I tell myself the year I gave him was real. That steady gentleness leaves a mark in a child even when the person is gone. I have to tell myself that. It is the only thing that makes the leaving bearable. I keep those copied pages to this day. I take the whole story out and look at it, sometimes the way you check that a wound has truly closed. And I think about that brown wicker basket that no one ever sewed from, sitting on its high shelf, full of women reduced to entries and costs. Katie made a record to control the truth, to keep it in one hand where it could always be revised. I made mine to set the truth loose, to put it somewhere she could never reach and never rename. 2 books, 2 hands, the same names. For the first time in my life, on the day I copied that last page, I understood the difference between being written about and being the one who writes. I am older now, and I keep my own house, small and plain and entirely mine. There is not much in it. A bed, a table, a chair by the window where the morning light comes in. But every object in it I chose. Every door I can open. There is money in a tin on the shelf that no one may move out of my reach, and there is no basket I am forbidden to touch, because there is nothing in this house that is kept from me. It took me years to understand how much that plainness is worth. A woman who has lived inside another family's secret learns to measure wealth differently. I measure mine in the things I am allowed to know. What I reclaimed was smaller and harder than freedom. I reclaimed my name. Not the name on a ledger beside a date and a cost, but the sound of it in my own mouth, spoken by a person who chose to speak it. The first time a friend in my new district said Miriam and meant only me, only the woman in front of her and no arrangement behind her, I had to leave the room to compose myself. I had been called wife and blessing and difficulty and a mother the district would not question. I had spent a year being every kind of useful. I had forgotten that a name could simply mean a person, wanted for no reason but herself, not everything closed. I want to be honest with you to the last because you have stayed with me through a long story and you deserve the truth without a bow tied on it. Eli grew up in that house, and I do not know the man he became. Katie, as far as I ever heard, kept her book and her standing and her careful even hand, and no reckoning ever came for her. The pattern I broke was one thread in a long weave, and I have no illusion that the weave stopped. Somewhere in some district, a girl with nothing is being told how blessed she is. That is the part I carry still. You do not always get to finish the thing you start. Sometimes you only get to refuse to add to it. I still think of that first night, the cold coffee and the folded quilts and the low voice bent into the dark toward a child I could not see. For a long time, that memory was my deepest wound. The moment I learned I was married to a man whose tenderness would never turn my way, it is not a wound anymore. When I take it out now, I see a frightened father keeping the one promise he could keep, and I do not resent it. His first words were not meant for me, and that was the truth of my whole marriage, told plainly in the first hour, if only I had known how to hear it. I did not fail to be loved. I was never brought there to be. If there is a meaning in it, it is this, and it is smaller than the speeches people expect. Being needed is not the same as being wanted, and being useful is not the same as being seen. I was needed in that house the way a beam is needed, and I mistook the weight resting on me for a kind of belonging. A great many people learn this lesson late, and not only in old farmhouses in quiet districts. It can happen in any home, any family, any place where someone is loved for the role they fill and would be replaced the moment the role changed. The house may look nothing like mine. The feeling of being placed rather than chosen is one many people know. So I will ask you something before I go, and it is not the question I usually hear asked. I do not want to know your pain. I want to know your noticing. When was the first time you sensed that the kindness around you had a purpose you were not told, that you were being provided for and quietly kept in the same breath, that noticing is not paranoia? In my life, it was the most useful thing I ever learned to trust, and I ignored it far too long. Tell me in the comments, if you would, when your own noticing first spoke to you and whether you listened, and what it cost you when you did or did not. If these stories matter to you, stay with me here. I mean to keep telling them, the true and the dramatized and the ones stitched together from many lives, always about women in closed and careful worlds who were written into other people's books and found, somehow, a way to pick up the pen. Not every one of them gets out. Not every one of them wins. But every one of them, at some point, stops being only a name in someone else's account and becomes the person who writes the record down. That is the story I am interested in. If it is the story you are interested in too, then you already know why I keep coming back to this window and this chair to tell it. I said at the beginning that the truest first words of my marriage were never meant for me. That is so. But I have learned there is another set of first words that matters more, and those are the ones a woman finally says on her own behalf, in her own voice, written in her own hand, where no one can revise them. Mine were not spoken to a bishop or shouted across a kitchen. They were pencil marks made by lamplight, copying a truth out of a book that had reduced me to a line, and carrying it out a door into a life that was mine. His first words were a promise to a child. My first words were a promise to myself. I have kept it.